We Made This.
Hello everyone, this is Tony, Network Chief of We Made This. As you know, our podcast network brings together a brilliant assortment of talent who talk about all kinds of pop culture content, such as the episode you've just listened to, or maybe you're just about to listen to. We're not going anywhere, but we'd love to keep the lights on for even longer if you're able to support our network on Patreon. For just £2 a month, you get your name in lights and the satisfaction of knowing you're helping us produce more great audio. And for £3 a month, you'll get your name in lights, but you'll also get access to an exclusive bi-monthly podcast from the We Made This talent pool on podcasting, pop culture, and, well, you tell us. We'll take your suggestions. For less than the price of a coffee per month, you can help keep We Made This going. Just head to patreon.com/We Made This. That's patreon.com/We Made This. And get the ball rolling. Now, back to your scheduled programming. Welcome back everyone to a podcast all about the sounds of cinema and discussion about them between the notes, which is where we come in. I'm Tony Black, and my co-host is Sean Wilson, and normally we both appear at the top of this episode, looking back at the film music year of 2020, but in recording this episode, we quickly realised we had 2 hours of material that would make a better two-part than one-part episode. So, we split it in half. We invite you, if you're just tuning in, to head back to our last episode and hear our selections from 10 down to 6, and then rejoin us here as we count down from 5 to 1 of our best scores of 2020. So you ready? Then let's dive right back in. Okay, let's get on to the big five then. So what are you going for halfway through? Your number 5 out of 10.
So I've gone for Parasite by Jung Jae-il. There we go. So Parasite needs little introduction, right? As a film, at least, it bears very little. It's one of the very, very few films that actually managed to get out in the UK before everything went to hell in a handcart last year. And thank goodness for that, because if we'd been deprived of Parasite, 2020 would have been even worse, I think, than what it was culturally. I'm just thankful that we got this back in February. We got it much later than most other countries, but it obviously went on to win several historic firsts for South Korea at the Oscars, including Best Picture. It's an extraordinary film, and it was my favourite film of last year. I included it as a UK release because my general rule of thumb is if you're doing a compilation of best films or best film scores, as long as it's released between the 1st of January and the 31st of December that year, as far as I'm concerned, it's fair game. That's the way that I do it in that country. 1st of January and 31st of December in the UK, that, as far as I'm concerned, that makes it relevant. And the Parasite was an extraordinary social satire that mixes very, very mordant humour with horror and this burgeoning, very, very biting awareness of the idea of a social underclass upon whom everyone else feeds, but the social underclass are themselves no angels. They are sort of atavistic as well, and they are scheming, and you have this awful cycle of people on both sides of the social divide feeding off each other, which that's what basically sustains society. That's what keeps everything going, and it's an incredibly lacerating look at the state of human affairs in the modern world. And obviously that those feelings have only accentuated since Parasite came out with coronavirus. It's a really extraordinary. The director Bong Joon-ho is a really astonishing filmmaker, and we made films like Snowpiercer, which we've referred to before. And Jung Jae-il's score is a really lovely kind of very almost like a stately classical score that treats the drama almost as this kind of unfolding operatic symphony. And it's lovely to see that Bong Joon-ho is able to use kind of an emphatic musical score, a very classically emphatic musical score, to basically amp up the satire of the movie. As we're watching the film in combination with the music, things only seem more and more absurd. They seem more grandiose, and I think it's a really, really good. There's the sequence leading up to, I forget the name of the track. I think it's called like the Belt of Faith or something. I might be misremembering that. Leading up to the invasive lower class family getting the upper class family's housekeeper booted out by basically suggesting that she's caught. I think it's TB in the film, and the music throughout that sequence is just amazing. It's a sublime score for a sublime film, I think.
I need to go back and listen to it, to be honest, because I didn't get a chance, and I thought the film was fantastic. I agree, absolutely. It's up there, for me, for the year, and yeah, I loved it. I'm looking forward to seeing it again. Actually, are you going to watch it in black and white? Because they've released one, haven't they? That does it like that. That could be interesting.
Yeah, I am genuinely interested. Actually, no, I did watch the black and white cut. Yeah, I did. I watched it during lockdown, and it's fascinating because I think that one of the film compositionally is really, really good. The film uses colour and depth of field brilliantly, and it's funny watching it in black and white. You kind of think, okay, that almost emphasises the irony of the story, in as much as in the story nothing is in black and white, so it almost goes inverse with the colour palette. But I did think the black and white actually diminished a lot of the nuances in the design. I mean, it was I don't think, I'm not sure if Bong Joon-ho shot it with an aim to be in black and white. I don't know if that's the case, because often if you are going to shoot a film in black and white, the considerations for that need to be taken in advance in terms of how you're going to design the sets, how you're going to light the thing. So yeah, it was an interesting experiment in black and white. I personally preferred it in colour. I think that was better for me.
Yeah, I'd be interested to watch that. I might well do it actually, and just see the comparison. But yeah, I will go back and listen to the score again, because I don't remember a vast amount of it, but it's been nearly a year since I watched the film. But yeah, you've got me really interested in that. So yeah, I mean, yeah, Parasite's just fab. Just, if you haven't seen it, just check it out. It's brilliant. So for my number 5, I'm going into television, and I've gone for the 3rd season of Westworld by Ramin Djawadi. And this came out last March. And it's kind of Djawadi's big number now after the end of Game of Thrones in 2019, which is obviously, I think, going to stand as one of his most famous sort of things throughout his career, really, depending on what he does next. But he's done, and Westworld hasn't quite, I think, reached the same amount of plaudits for the music as Game of Thrones did amongst people who enjoyed it. And to be fair, the 3rd season of Westworld really, really, really did. It was really hammered by a lot of people, actually. Although I did enjoy it. It's not the best season of the show, but because what he does in this is the show moves away from the Western setting. It's barely in Westworld anymore. It's set in the mid 21st century, sort of out of the park where the robots are now starting, the synthetic, whatever they're called, hosts are now starting to sort of spill out into the real world, and it's causing all kinds of problems. And I mean, I do think Westworld is one of these shows that's a bit misunderstood, actually, because I think it gets a bad rap for the fact that it's actually trying to do some really fascinating things. And maybe when it's all said and done, when people can look at the whole tapestry of the show, I think it might be better thought of, to be honest, because I think it's always been a little bit misjudged, really. But I think the music's always really good. I think Djawadi was excellent in Game of Thrones, I think, at finding motifs for so many of the characters, and he does a similar thing in Westworld, and he manages to find a lot of these recurring sort of motifs going through it. And he does that whole thing that Westworld's sort of become a little bit of a trademark, in that he orchestrally covers certain, well-known tunes. So this season we get Guns N' Roses' Sweet Child of Mine, we get Wicked Games by The Weeknd, which I thought was the standout for me in those covers, which is great. A version of Brain Damage from Pink Floyd's The Dark Side of the Moon. So there's a real range of things that I think is really interesting. One of the interesting things he does with Westworld. But I think season 2 remains the score of his that I love the most from Westworld. I think there's some really grand sweeping stuff in there that he doesn't normally do, and he didn't. Season 3 didn't fit that in the same way because it was a different kind of year for the show. But yeah, I really like it, and I think it deserves. I think his music in general deserves a little bit more appreciation, actually, because I think he's better than a lot of people say he is.
Yeah, I mean, Ramin Djawadi, his magnum opus will clearly be Game of Thrones. As far as I'm concerned, I haven't seen or heard Westworld, so I can't really comment on that necessarily. But Ramin Djawadi has done a lot of scores I've not been a particular fan of. He's done some good scores. He did like Pacific Rim, the first Pacific Rim movie, which was good fun. But I can't say as I'm familiar with Westworld. I've heard mixed things about the show itself, but I would imagine that it kind of gets under the skin of that. Obviously, the whole idea of human versus robot, right? I imagine that underpins a lot of the music.
Completely, yeah. Absolutely. There's this sort of combination of synthetic sound, human emotion, strings, and because the whole show is all about really what is, what does it mean to be human? What is it? What is the difference? There's a line, because the whole thing is the hosts appear human in so many ways, and there's a line I think early on where somebody says, "If you can't tell, does it matter?" And so that's sort of like with the whole underpinning thing of the show, and there's a lot going on in there. I mean, it's a real mixture, but I think he does it really well. I think he scores it really well, and it's coming back for a season 4. I don't know how many fans are coming back, frankly, at this stage. It's really unlike Game of Thrones. Westworld is a bit too esoteric and weird, really. I mean, that was the thing about Game of Thrones. And I think why again that is underrated and misjudged, because they managed to take something which is completely like out there fantasy in the books, and they made it accessible for audiences who then kept coming back, and they found things in there that, and intentionally they dialed down a lot of the fantasy elements until much later in the show, when they'd earned the right to throw all the dragons in there and all the White Walkers and all this. They didn't do a lot of that in the early days, and it kept people in. Whereas Westworld very quickly went into some really esoteric weird shit. And so I think a bit like Lost. Lost had exactly the same problem. Even though the score to Lost is a masterpiece from beginning to end, not many people have probably heard the last few seasons of glorious Michael Giacchino music for that show, because they weren't watching it, and because it gets all into time traveling islands and it's just bonkers. So Westworld is going a little bit like that in a way. So it's a shame, because there's some good stuff in there. So I would encourage anyone to go and check it out. Definitely. Let's move on then. Number 4. What have you gone for?
So
what have you gone for?
What have I gone for? Nice. There we go. What I'm for. For 4, I've gone for. Yeah, exactly. I've gone for Enola Holmes by Daniel Pemberton. So this was another Netflix movie, and I have to say I thought a rather good Netflix movie. Actually, the idea is that it's nominally a Sherlock Holmes story, but he is not the centre of it. It kind of inverts the canon, tweaks it somewhat to focus on Sherlock Holmes' sister, Enola Holmes, played by Millie Bobby Brown from Stranger Things, and she is on a quest to go and search for her mother who disappeared, and this takes her into Victorian London. There's a sort of web of intrigue opens up, and she meets up with this young guy played by Louis Partridge who helps her, and then on the sidelines you have Holmes played by Henry Cavill. And it's an interesting. I think it's actually it's an interesting film. I was, when I went into it, I was a bit cautious, because I kind of thought, okay, have they literally tried to just woke this up for the sake of woking it up? And I thought it looked a bit cringy from the outside of it. Much as obviously, as I said when talking about Laura Cartman, clearly the notion of gender parity and gender representation is clearly starting to filter down through the conversation now, albeit probably far too slowly. But I wasn't sure about the film, and I thought it was really, really good. I thought it captured the period really well. I thought Millie Bobby Brown's performance was really good, and crucially, the score is lovely. Daniel Pemberton's score is really, really nice, because it is exactly what it's supposed to be. It's a score of themes. It's a score of clear, buoyant sunny identities, which is exactly what you want, because that is what Millie Bobby Brown brings to the role. And clearly one doesn't have to look very hard to see that Danielle Pemberton is feeding off that exuberance, the fact that she is a detective in the making, but she's a nascent detective. She's kind of like raw and rough around the edges, and Holmes is clearly the sophisticated one. But one assumes that she's going to come into her own like that, presumably over the course of several more movies. But it's that identity that underpins the really kind of bouncy, lovely main theme, and that warmth continues all the way through the score. And I think it's a classic old school adventure score. I mean, Sherlock Holmes there's been some extraordinary music written for Sherlock Holmes movies. I mean, pretty much every Sherlock Holmes movie, I think, has had some kind of remarkable score attached to it. I mean, my favourite being Young Sherlock Holmes by Bruce Broughton from 1985, which I think is just a masterpiece, and we've talked about that before on an episode, I think, about, was that 1980s adventure scores? We talked about that.
I think so.
That was a lockdown episode we did last year, wasn't it? But then obviously, and then we've got David Arnold and Michael Price for the TV series Sherlock, the Benedict Cumberbatch, Martin Freeman series. So Sherlock Holmes has been treated to many, many different musical iterations, but it's nice that we now have a kind of adjunct to that, the Enola Holmes adjunct to it, which is now being graced with its own really optimistic, buoyant soundtrack. And Daniel Pemberton's a really interesting composer. He's done, I loved his score for The Man from U.N.C.L.E. I thought that had a really lovely 1960s Euro Mediterranean chic to it. I really like what he did for Steve Jobs, the Danny Boyle movie, where it went from kind of 80s slightly blobby synth sounds into a more sophisticated electro orchestral sound. I think he's a really interesting composer and really diverse. You don't quite know what he's going to come up with from project to project, but I think in this instance it was kind of like, no, I'm going to leave the experimentalism to one side and just get straight to the heart of the movie with the symphony orchestra, and I thought that was exactly the right thing to do.
Yeah. I agree. I think he's had he's had a busy year. I think another one he did was Birds of Prey earlier in the year, which was different to this, different kind of thing. So he's been busy. He's always seems to be quite busy, he really can turn on various different styles and things like that, which is really good. I thought this was a really nice score. I do agree. I didn't really love the film particularly. I struggled with the film. I thought it was just a bit. Yeah, I wasn't really into it, to be honest.
Bit naff, maybe.
Yeah, a little bit. And it wasn't really for me personally, but I did like the music, and that was what I said to my wife. I came out of it. I said the score to that's great, but I'm not going to watch the film again. But I'll listen to the score.
Yeah,
But different strokes and all that. But we definitely, it's a really nice piece of music. Yeah. So for my number 4, I've gone for another one I haven't seen. The last one I haven't seen, to be fair, which is The Rhythm Section. A film by Reed Morano starring Blake Lively, Jude Law, Sterling K. Brown, about a grieving woman who sets out for revenge after discovering the plane crash that killed her family was a terrorist attack. Now, this has a score by a composer called Steve Mazzaro, who is somebody I'm not massively familiar with at all. And the film was a bit of a mixed bag, I think. I think it was, from what people have said, it was a bit all over the place, even though Blake Lively's quite good in it. But I thought the score was great. I thought the score was really... There's a lot of like...
I haven't listened to this and I haven't seen the film either. Is it kind of like John Barry? Is it going for that, or is it going for something more modern
it's
than
going
that?
For... I wouldn't say it's John Barry. I'd say it's going for something along the lines of really scoring the emotion of the whole thing. And I'm struggling off the top of my head to think of a comparison to this. It's not got that sort of beauty and sweep of Barry or that kind of thing, but it does have a sort of classical intensity to it, and I can't quite pin down who I'd compare this to.
It's not a Bourne score, then, is it? It's not
No.
as kind of gritty as that, like John Powell.
No, because the film, you'd think it would be, because the film is Blake Lively in sort of full on sort of action mode. The film's been sort of likened to things like Atomic Blonde and that kind of stuff. Red Sparrow. And it's produced by Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson from the Bond films. So you'd think it was... So there's definitely going to be some action in this. But it's not it's not approached in those terms. It's approached... There's a lot of, like, strings in there. It's really quite beautiful stuff. But it's also really quite intense and sad. And it was really surprising to me. I really was quite taken aback with how gorgeous it was and how evocative. So I again, we'll put some. There was some additional music by Lisa Gerrard. Hans Zimmer produced it as well, but it doesn't have that bombast or anything like that. We'll put some in the playlist for people to listen to. But I'd encourage anyone to check this out. It's made me want to see the film, actually, even though the film's supposed to be a bit. I really want to see it now because I actually think the score was terrific. So yeah, I'm looking forward to catching the movie. And maybe once I've seen the movie, I can articulate what it is about this I like so much, because I'm almost struggling in a way. It just arrested me a little bit, which is a nice feeling to have, actually. You know, when you listen to something, you go, blimey, this is good. And you can't almost pin down why. You know, that's quite nice.
Yeah.
Number 3. What have you gone for, Sean?
So we've got another Netflix series and accompanying score, The Queen's Gambit by Carlos Rafael Rivera. Did you watch this over Christmas? Did you see it?
Well, funnily enough, I had at the start of last week, I had 2 days where I was working from home before I was going into a whole new job. And because I thought I was going to be working from home a lot more than I am, I thought, do you know what? I'm going to watch The Queen's Gambit in one day. So that's what I did. Yeah. I watched all 7 episodes of The Queen's Gambit in one morning and afternoon. So yes, I have seen it.
And it's sublime, isn't it? It's a really, really good. So I'm saying that. I'm assuming. Did you think that as well? Like...
No. I thought it was impressive. Sorry. I thought it was impressive. I thought Anya Taylor-Joy was great in the main role. I thought it looked really good. The score, as I'm sure you'll talk about, I thought was really good. But I found it wasn't quite my cup of tea in terms of story and that kind of thing, and I think it was a bit overlong. But I don't want to take the wind out yourself. You clearly loved it.
No, I really liked it. It's adapted from the Walter Tevis novel of the same name by Scott Frank, who's the showrunner, the Netflix showrunner in this instance. Scott Frank was the writer of, among other things, Out of Sight and Minority Report. A really, really good screenwriter. And I didn't know anything about this. So I knew Anya Taylor-Joy was in it. I knew it was about chess. I really don't give two hoots about chess. Never played it. Never will play it.
It's not really about chess, is it? It's one of those things it's not. It's about chess, but it's not about chess.
And you just nailed exactly what it is that works for me about the thing. It's about a chess player, Beth Harmon, played by Anya Taylor-Joy, but it's more about her inner struggle and how that's manifested on the chessboard, how that's manifested in the matches, because she's not just moving that rook or that knight. She is negotiating a life that has been thrown into turmoil for various reasons. You know, she's when we first meet her, she's in a boarding school and she doesn't have any parents. Then later on, when she becomes an adolescent, she starts to grapple with drug addiction and alcohol addiction. And Anya Taylor-Joy is really magnetic, and it's obviously ravishingly designed. It's set throughout I think it's the end of the 1950s onwards, isn't it? So it's got a real lovely Art Deco look to it. It's really ravishingly designed. But one of the score by Carlos Rafael Rivera recognises that despite the fact that the story is set at a very, very singular moment in film in our history in the 1960s, largely the themes of the story are timeless. So it's about the idea of the Queen's Gambit is kind of like. That describes the chess move, the opening chess move from a certain player, and the Beth is kind of like constantly making her first move into another stage of her life, and these are themes that have occupied all of us. Like, how do we navigate our own lives? They are timeless, they are archetypal. So the use of the symphony orchestra to create this really sweeping kind of elegiac sense of forward propulsion, particularly in the main titles, which I think are electrifying, is a really clever. It's a really clever thing to do. I think it creates an emotional directness that stands apart from the incidental period trappings that you see in the show. And I've seen a lot of weird comments online about how, you know, it's not an organic score. It was large parts of it or all of it were done with like samples and everything. And I think, again, there's an interview on Composer magazine that I write for edited by Lauren Sunderland, who, you know, you can see that there is a shot of Rivera conducting the orchestra. He talks about the orchestra that he used. I think it might have been the Bratislavan orchestra. I might be misremembering that, but there was an orchestra involved. I mean, regardless of whether there might have been a little bit of digital touching up on certain, you know, on certain notes, on certain chord progression, I'm sure every single film score digitally augments its music in some way now because the technology is there. The point is, it sounds organic. The themes are really good. There's another sub-theme leitmotif for the character of Borgov, I think he's called, who's the Russian like nemesis that Beth will eventually come up against. I mean, a large part of the score are actually, it's a lot about the restraint of it, because a lot of the score isn't as thunderous as that main title would imply. A lot of it kind of uses fragments of that theme, but builds often quite a melancholic sense of sadness, because this character goes through a lot of sadness in her life. But it earns the right to really go full bore with that main theme during the climactic sequence. I won't give away what it is, because if anyone's listening to this and they haven't seen the show, they really ought to get the impact of that really luscious symphony during the final movement of the show, which I thought was really powerful. I thought it really worked, and it did the thing that I want film and soundtrack music to do, is it's adding more meaning and more understanding to my knowledge of the central character. I thought this was superb. Couldn't recommend it enough.
Yeah, that's a great summation of it. Yeah, definitely. I thought the music really did stand out to me as really quite beautiful, and it's all there. It's all there on Spotify and all these kind of places. So yeah, I haven't listened to it in its entirety on its own, and I'm going to do that because I think it's really, really great. So yeah, and to be fair, most people thought the Queen's Gambit was brilliant. Like you are far more in the majority in what you think of that show than I am. Really. So don't worry about that.
Don't worry. I've been in the minority on lots of things.
Yeah,
you know, I think Chariots of Fire is a load of old toots. So what do I know? So it's like,
I've never seen that actually.
Haven't you? Don't bother. It's boring.
Don't bother watching it.
Yeah.
Okay, my number 3, I don't know if you've seen this one. This is one that came out on Christmas Eve last year, The Midnight Sky, directed by George Clooney, starring Clooney, Felicity Jones, David Oyelowo. Decent cast, set in the relatively near future, part post-apocalypse, part space-bound sort of movie. After a climate disaster, George Clooney's alone, looking after the child of a family who have left this remote outpost, and then he finds out that a space mission is coming back to this world that's been ravaged, and you know how do these two stories collide. Scored by Alexandre Desplat, and I found, to be honest, I found the film quite tedious and slow and a bit dour, really. Didn't really do it. George Clooney's funny because he's you know, on the face of it, you know, he's a modern Cary Grant, but then he makes these really sort of either quite melancholy or dour films quite often, or films that are a bit odd in terms of the way they approach, you know, their style or their comedy. It's a weird thing in a way, like, because you'd think he'd make these quite stylish, sweeping kind of films full of charisma, but I don't know. I mean, it wasn't my cup of tea, but the score I thought was great. I thought the score was beautiful. I mean, Desplat very rarely puts a foot wrong, really, and he can turn his hand to almost anything. But in this, he really captures, I think, a lot of the, you know, both that sort of isolation and that emotion, and it's not one of those kind of scores like another Clooney, one of Clooney's better, more recent films like Gravity, where, you know, it's in space. It's a different kind of score to that. It's much more grounded, I think, much more, you know, tethered to character and emotion, but it still has that sort of otherworldly sense to it. I thought it was really nice. Have you checked these out?
So I'm really glad that you summed up the plot there, because I watched this it's a Netflix release. I watched it over December, and I thought it was so dull. I was genuinely quite staggered by how poor this film was, and I thought, George Clooney, like, how has George Clooney made something this languorous and this reliant on cliche? And it's one of those awful movies whereby it's got such a kind of horribly kind of stretched out languorous pace to it, and yet within that pace it will indulge in the most like fatuous Hollywood cliches as well. It's kind of like, okay, so you're taking a very long time to elaborate a dramatic point that I was able to predict about 30 minutes beforehand. So and it's just, I thought it was really, it looks amazing, and clearly it does. I mean, it's got George Clooney directing it. There's obviously money behind it, so it looks amazing. But I just thought it was awful. And George, you're right. George Clooney is a funny one because George Clooney has got the matinee idol good looks, and there's a lot to like about George Clooney. I mean, he's got solidly liberal credentials, and he's got a good sense of humour. And you think, he has directed some interesting films. You think of Confessions of a Dangerous Mind or Good Night and Good Luck. But recently, George Clooney's gone really off the boil with the films that he's been directing himself. He's made some really awful things like Suburbicon, which was also scored by Alexandre Desplat. And you think, like, what's happened? Like, where's his mojo gone? And just, it's weird. But actually, the film was so boring that it actually negated any awareness to me on the part of the score. That's how boring I thought the film was. I didn't notice the score in the context of the film because the film was so dull. And I had to separate the score out from the film and listen to it on its own. I was like, wow, this is it's like I was discovering it for the first time, which I wasn't. Yeah. It's really weird. Yeah. Isn't that strange? And I just thought that there's a strained sense of sadness to it, which Desplat can do really well. You think of recent hits like The Shape of Water and things like that. There's a lovely melancholy to it. There's the track which everyone has cited, people who follow film scores have cited, Iris in the Stars, which is got, I think that's the name of the track. It's got a lovely sense of longing. So longing is the term. There are, unusually for Desplat, there are some quite aggressively like modernistic electronic textures in it, which he sometimes indulges in, but not normally this overtly. But it's lovely to be able to separate a great score from a terrible movie and to be able to appreciate the nuances of what a composer can do. And as you said, Desplat is fun. He's been a little bit quiet in the last couple of years. I mean, he did Little Women last year, but I interviewed him for The Shape of Water, and he was lovely. And he was very, very, very French. I mean, that's ridiculously French. And I mean, I asked him. Yeah, it was literally almost like that. I mean, it was almost like I asked him like, what were your musical influences? Well, there are so many influences. It's like the layers of my influence. You could say it is like a millefeuille. So French cakes are millefeuilles. There are a lot of layers, and I built up these layers of influence over the years. I was like, that's a lovely analogy. That they use the millefeuille to suggest the different layers of influence. He was wonderful, and he is a great composer. And I think if anyone comes out of the mess of The Midnight Sky unscathed, it is him. Let's be honest about that.
I think that's exactly it. I think, again, this is going in my crap films, great scores list. It's doing well, that list. I'll tell you, it's getting a few this year. So, it's a shame. But definitely listen to the score. Right, number 2, penultimate then. What have you gone for? I tell you what, your choice here. I mean, the only reason I didn't pick it in my top 10 is because I knew you would. So, let's reveal it.
That's the advantage of going in twos, actually, isn't it? Because you know someone else is going to pick up the slack. It's The Personal History of David Copperfield by Christopher Willis, which is just a beautiful score. And it's a film, Armando Iannucci's adaptation of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, and with Dev Patel in the central role. So I said with Enola Holmes that it broke with the canonical Holmes stories. This breaks with the traditional, like, white anglicised tradition of Dickens by casting Dev Patel in the central role. But he is brilliant. He brings that real spirit and ebullient sense of spirit to the role, and the score is lovely because it's the story, as per the book and the film. It's about the creation of an artistic personality. It's about the formation of a life, basically, as implied by the title, and you see the birth of an artistic consciousness coming into focus in front of you through David's life, various tragedies, triumphs, like losses, wins, gains, everything like that. And Iannucci stitches it together really, really well. And what you need is a really sumptuous, kind of rich score to really emphasize the emotional register of what David is going through at each moment. This is not a movie in which a score that was holding back would necessarily work, because you really do need to feel that you are getting the sweep of an entire life in front of you. And I think that's what Christopher Willis does really well. There's overtones of Vaughan Williams in there, which is probably unsurprising because Vaughan Williams exerts a huge influence over pretty much every score that's set in and around Britain. That sense of pastoral beauty. There are moments of darkness in it as well. It comes to a lovely, really fulsome orchestral summation at the end during the climactic sequence, in which there's a lovely figurative, like, visual expression. David is almost confronted with the younger version of himself as a child, and it does play into that sense of what would you say to your younger self if you could be confronted with them? Like, what would what would you say? And the music really does get the profundity of that, I think, really well. I mean, this film came out right at the very start of 2020, and I don't know if it quite got the attention that it deserved. The score certainly didn't, because the score is sublime. But yeah, I think in terms of doing what film and music should do, which is go hand in hand together to deepen our understanding of the central character, yeah, it does it magnificently well.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think it's wonderful. And the film, I caught the film later in the year. I caught it we rented it, and it's a lovely film, really, really good film. Very much enjoyed it. And so, but I think it did get a little bit lost in a way. I think it came out a bit later in the States, I think, as well. So it didn't, with everything else going on this year, it kind of slipped under the radar slightly, I think. But it's just a lovely package altogether. A really colourful, beautiful, picture. Some fantastic performances. It's funny, and then with this gorgeous. I mean, Christopher Willis is again like doing some fantastic stuff. I mean, The Death of Stalin was great as well.
Yeah, it was
before this for Iannucci.
I watched that with my introduced that to my parents for the first time during lockdown number 2, and they were kind of like, the kind of contradictory response to it. But the music really stood out. That idea of the Soviet anthem, which amplifies the comedy and the horror of the situation, worked really well.
Really good. Yeah, really good. He's very talented. So yeah, hopefully he'll keep this partnership with Iannucci going, actually, because they're doing some great things together. So my number 2, I've gone for one that I felt like deserved inclusion, even though the film doesn't deserve an inclusion on anyone's top 10, really. This is the Robert Zemeckis remake of The Witches, which is scored by Alan Silvestri. So this is a combination going back 35 years, or more, all the way back to Back to the Future. And Silvestri's kind of, been in the eye lately in the last few years with the Avengers movies, and he's done some great stuff for that. And I thought the score for The Witches was what you'd almost expect, for a film like this. It had all a lot of the, Silvestri sort of trademarks. It had that sense of flair and that sense of magic, I think, to it, and that sense of, true escapism in a way that the film doesn't. I mean, maybe I'm being a bit unfair on the film because I keep thinking of the Nicholas Roeg film from 1990, the Angelica Houston starring film, which is creepy and weird and not by any means perfect, but really stays in your mind, that film, that adaptation of the Roald Dahl story, which in its is quite sinister, for a kid's story. I mean, I remember reading The Witches when I was a kid, and it stuck with me. It's a really sinister story. It's about witches who basically sort of, eat children, kill and eat children and stuff. And the film is okay, but it doesn't do either the book or that original film, I think, any real justice. It's all just mostly, big performances and CGI. Really, it doesn't really hold any kind of particular heart to it, but I did like the score, and I think anything where Silvestri is able to do this kind of stuff, I think deserves to be up there, really.
Yes, Silvestri is one of the kings of the kind of family fantasy comedy score, really, and he is one of the last bastions of that 1980s symphonic fantasy score. You think we've lost people like James Horner, Basil Polidorus, Jerry Goldsmith. I mean, Alan Silvestri is one of the last people left now. He's in his 70s, as I understand it, and he is, in terms of the professionalism that he brings, not just his collaborations with Robert Zemeckis, as you said, which go back decades, but his other films as well. He is one of those craftsmen that build the scores around themes. There are themes, there are clear building blocks with which an audience is meant to create emotional identification. You think of, like you mentioned there, the Avengers theme, which has now seemingly been finally semi-adapted into the Marvel Cinematic Universe's overarching theme, and we need to wait and see how that's going to be adapted as we go into Marvel Phase 4 and Phase 5. I mean, hopefully it will play a role somewhere in there, but musical continuity in Marvel films is something else we can go into on obviously on another episode entirely. I mean, to put my cards on the table, I haven't seen this version of The Witches. Obviously, it was going to go out theatrically in the UK. Then it went out onto streaming because everything went wrong with the virus and cinemas shut again. I saw the trailer for it. I thought it looked awful. I thought the trailer looked really terrible, and I hold the Nick Rogue one in really high regard because that's the Nick Rogue one is genuinely malevolent and genuinely terrifying. And it's terrifying because of the practicality of the makeup, of the Grand High Witch makeup is really visibly horrible. And it's the score by Stanley Myers, who was collaborated with Hans Zimmer when Hans Zimmer was first coming onto the scene in the 1980s, is really great for the 1991 as well. It's got a real whimsical sense of menace to it. So I thought, okay, I've not seen the film, but I've kind of got an idea of what to expect from Alan Silvestri's score based on his past collaborations with Zemeckis, based on what I've seen in the trailer, based on the fact that he is a safe pair of hands. And yeah, it's a really great score. It does. There's nothing wrong with the score doing what you expect it to do. Sometimes that is exactly what you need. And clearly for a movie like this, I mean, what you need is what Silvestri does, which is you have the portentousness, the comic portentousness of the theme for the witches, obviously in this case represented by Anne Hathaway, but it's laced with just enough of a tongue-in-cheek sense of humour to obviously moderate the fact that otherwise this would be quite scary for young children. So Silvestri has got that sense of awareness, but there's a lovely kind of devilish waltz-like piece for a solo violin, which reminded me to some extent of his theme for Death Becomes Her, which I think is a brilliant score in a really funny film. Like, that's another Zemeckis collaboration. More people need to talk about that, both the film and the score, because I describe Death Becomes Her sounds like Bernard Herrmann on nitrous oxide. That's basically how I describe it, and it's just like, and there's a lot of that sort of darkly comic spirit at work in The Witches, which it uses a traditional symphony to envelop you in a world of menace, of magic, of fun, regardless of what the film's like, and I haven't seen it. I could build a mental picture in my mind of what's happening in the film based on how brilliantly Silvestri uses the orchestra, but that is a trademark of his, and I really hope that we're not going to completely lose that when people of his generation are no longer around. I mean, clearly we've talked about several composers throughout this particular episode who are picking up the baton to some extent. You think of people like Daniel Pemberton, who, you know, can use themes. They can obviously put themes in service of quite an experimental score. You think of things like Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. But yeah, in terms of Silvestri just doing what he's supposed to do, which is to work with his director and get to the emotional essence of the movie. He does that in The Witches brilliantly.
And I think to be honest, you won't love the film. Really, right. I think knowing you and knowing what you think about the original, you know, the 90 version of Witches, which is, you know, the same as me, I think you'll watch it and go, really, you know. So don't go out your way. Wait till it's on streaming and you've got a spare hour and a half. You know, you put it on in the background, because I think really that's the best thing for it. But the score, yeah, it does what it needs to. And it does it well. For me. So, like, yeah, I think you're right in that you can probably imagine what the movie is from that score. But the score, again, is better than the film. So, again, it goes in the letterbox list. This is doing well. Crap movies, good scores.
Yeah.
All right, then, you're number one. Now, I have to say, Sean, I never thought I would live to see the day that this composer was your number one of any year. But here we are.
I mean, you think you're surprised. I'm absolutely stunned as well. So, for the first time in goodness knows how long, I've got a Hans Zimmer score at the very top of my top 10 best scores of the year list. People might be able to divine what that is based on that. It's Wonder Woman 1984. And again, cards on the table. I've not seen the film yet. the film was meant to have come out theatrically in the UK. Obviously, that didn't work. It's too complicated to go into the reasons why that didn't work. The fact of the matter is, it didn't come out theatrically in the UK. There was we rather naively thought there was an outside chance it was going to. Then when we got into October, November 2020, it's like, yeah, that's not going to happen, is it? So it's just, and apparently it's now gone out onto streaming in this country, but not on HBO Max, because we don't have HBO Max over here, but they do have HBO Max in America. It's a mess. It's such a mess. It's such a mess, and it's a real shame, because this is the best score that Hans Zimmer has come up with in a very, very long time, and it's a real shame that of all the films, this is the film that hasn't come out theatrically. This is the film that hasn't kind of got out in a non-pandemic situation, because more people would have heard this score, had the movie been released in a non-pandemic situation. I think it's wonderful, and it's, to just set the record straight, Hans Zimmer is one of my favourite composers. I don't have anything against Hans Zimmer. He's done an extraordinary amount for film music. However, there is a risk with Hans Zimmer that his style, his sound, has in recent years fallen into self-parody. It's not been helped by scores that he's done, and it's not helped by the fact that it's perpetuated by the other composers who come up through his remote control studio and basically are asked by the producers and the directors to go, oi, we want something to sound like Hans Zimmer, but we can't get Hans Zimmer to compose it. That's not entirely Zimmer's fault. I mean, that is in large part the fault of the franchise producers and the filmmakers. But that very, very over-cranked, over-processed sound that mistakes noise for nuance is something I've had a real problem with, particularly in the last 15 to 20 years. Hans Zimmer has done very fine scores in the last 15 to 20 years. I think you think of the Sherlock Holmes scores, which I really, really like, precisely because they've got character to them. They are odd, they are offbeat, they're quirky. They're not just this kind of homogenous blob of sound, which I think has been bolted to so many of the superhero films that Hans Zimmer has done recently, which is why it's wonderful that in Wonder Woman 1984 it comes roaring out of the traps with something called Joy of Joys, a theme. There is a theme in it, and it's a wonderful one. It's triumphant, it's exuberant, it's clearly meant to reinforce appropriately enough, the wonder of Gal Gadot's performance as Diana Prince, as Wonder Woman. She is obviously an unashamedly virtuous character. She is a force for good. There's no dressing that up, and Zimmer's brief is obviously to get that in the form of the music, and he latches onto it brilliantly, and I think he exploits that theme really well throughout the score. He deconstructs it, he turns it around. There are other themes as well. There's romantic longing for the fact that Steve Trevor, Chris Pine's character, comes back from the dead, having not apparently died in World War One in the first Wonder Woman movie. There's real yearning in the score. There's real interesting kind of analog, squidgy electronic experimentation, because obviously that befits the time period in which the film is set. But also it's interesting because Zimmer himself rose to prominence during that period. Zimmer worked with the Buggles on Video Killed the Radio Star, which I think is something that a lot of people tend to forget. So, and he did the theme for Going for Gold, the BBC series. So this is kind of like, people forget
still
that as
one
well.
Of my favourite random bits of trivia. Yeah.
It's
amazing.
So Zimmer started to come into his own around the mid-1980s. So in a way, through the medium of this score, he is going back to revisit the period that set him on the path to becoming this extraordinary film composer. And I think this is a really, really wonderful score. It does the thing that superhero scores are meant to do, which it doesn't dwell in murk and bombast for the sake of someone thinking that's going to make it more profound, which is a really stupid mentality, and God knows that's blighted so many superhero films recently. It's fun. It's got a sense of fun to it. I imagine that the film follows suit. I mean, I've read mixed things about the film. I haven't seen it, so I can't comment on that. What I can say is that the music is magnificent, and it's the first Hans Zimmer score to top my top 10 list in a very long time.
Well, that is really good, and I do agree that it's a really, really good score. This probably would have been on my top 10. I have seen the film. I think it's okay. like it's been savaged actually by a lot of people. I wouldn't go that far. I don't. You know, there's lots of people saying, "Oh, it's this, it's that, it's the other." Like, it is basically a 1980s Superman movie. Essentially, that's what they've done. They've made an old school 80s. Like, and that's probably not good praise, is it? 80s Superman.
No, it really is.
But what I mean by that is, it is that same sort of spectacle and colour. You know, you've got Pedro Pascal playing basically Gene Hackman's Lex Luthor. You know, you've got Chris Pine standing in for Lois. You know, it is very Clark and Lois, their whole relationship. You know, there's a lot of that stuff, and it's a bit of a throwback in that way. But I think it's intentionally so, and I think that the score definitely plays into that. You know, that kind of light-hearted. It's much more of a light-hearted film than the last one. You know, it's much more colourful and bright and very. It taps into all that sort of 80s sort of Stranger Things aesthetic that's been in vogue since that show really took off. So, you know, again, you can probably imagine the kind of film it is, Sean. Really,
yeah.
And I think you'll find that when you watch it. Really, I think it doesn't have the heft of the first one, but I think the score really does help. I think it makes a big difference. So I can understand why it's your number one, because I really enjoyed it, and it really does stand up on a solo listen completely.
For me, it's a reminder that Hans Zimmer can really pull it out of the bag when it comes to really characterful scores. You know, we get so used to Hans Zimmer's recent scores just drowning us in noise, and you know, it's a reminder that, you know, he started off by doing things like Rain Man and Driving Miss Daisy and Backdraft, and you know, and then there are other magnificent scores like Beyond Rangoon or The Thin Red Line. I'd call The Thin Red Line, I'd say, is probably his masterpiece, and it's just real melodic scores that are based on logical, linear ideas that are very emotionally direct, and that is the Hans Zimmer that I like. That's the side of Hans Zimmer that I like, and I think this Wonder Woman 1984, the score for it, gets back to that kind of Hans Zimmer. It reconnects me to it, and I can't say how joyous it is to be able to say that.
Yeah, no, it is good, and it's nice because, you know, I've maybe liked some more of the Hans Zimmer stuff of recent years than you have, but I think, yeah, it is not, and it bodes well for the two big hitters that we might well, depending on what 2021's like, we might well get. You know, No Time to Die, Dune. I mean, they're going to be fascinating to see now. So hopefully he's going to strike lucky with 3 cracking scores in a year. So we'll see what happens. So my number one will surprise nobody, because I've gone for Tenet by Ludwig Goransson. I you know, bigged that up when we last spoke. Again, we've talked in depth about that in a previous episode. But you know, and I if not for this, I might have put his score for The Mandalorian season 2 on here on my top 10 as well, because he's done a great work on that show as well. I mean, the second season of The Mandalorian is great anyway. It's really, really good, and the music again. He really does have the opportunity at one point to really bring out John Williams stuff as well, which is lovely. For one scene in particular, which I won't spoil, but you probably know what it is because it's all over the internet. Yeah. But Tenet was great. I think, you know, I really liked the movie. You know, it was my favourite movie of last year, and I think that I loved the score to this. I thought it was a film that Zimmer would have done had he not been busy scoring Dune. But Goransson does a great job here. I mean, it's such a huge but sweeping score with really strange rhythms in there, while also being a little bit James Bond at points. You know, I just think it's great. I think it's great, and like I say, we talked more in depth about it in a previous episode, but I've listened to this one, I think, more than a lot of the others this year, and it's been on replay in the last few months. So, yeah, that's what I'm going for.
Well, it's from my point of view, it's interesting because, bearing in mind, I've just said that I've gone through an extensive period of Hans Zimmer scores that I haven't liked, many of which have been Christopher Nolan, who obviously directed Tenet, and there was a question with Tenet. Okay, so for the first time in a very long time, Nolan hasn't worked with Zimmer, he's worked with Ludwig Goransson. And okay, so how much can Goransson escape that all-consuming Zimmer sound, that style? Because I think Christopher Nolan is very, very singular in terms of, right, that's what I want my films to sound like. And I've had real problems with that with Nolan in the past. Again, I think he has been guilty. He's one of my favourite directors, but in terms of the way he uses music, he's been guilty of just turning the volume up to 11 while not encouraging the composer to do anything particularly interesting with it. And that is an issue that I have. And I thought when I came to Tenet, I was kind of like, okay, bearing that in mind, I also have to bear in mind that Goransson himself is a real experimentalist. He's been very radical in his own right. You think of his collaborations with Childish Gambino, which have been really interesting. He's also done... Obviously, he won the first ever Oscar for a comic book score with Black Panther, and that was a terrific score. And I thought that score melded the experimental and the tribal and the symphonic facets together in a way that was really interesting. So I kind of came to Tenet thinking, okay, am I going to hear something that sounds like Ludwig Goransson, or am I going to get a kind of classic, like, diet, sort of watered down Hans Zimmer thing? And I think it's kind of a mixture of both. I think the score is functionally effective, which I think is probably the best thing you could say about any of the music in Nolan's movies, really. It does the job. That there is a sense of propulsion to it. And as anyone who's seen the film knows, it doesn't hang around and it doesn't explain itself to people.
Yeah.
There is this just forward thrust on it, which is combined with a very, very aggressive sound design that's been, knocked from pillar to post, deservedly so, because I saw it 3 times and I was still struggling to understand what they were saying to each other on the third viewing. And it's a very complicated thing with Nolan, because he doesn't like actors doing ADR, additional dialogue recording. He likes dialogue to be captured raw on the set, which makes things very difficult to listen to when it's eventually mixed down into the sound. And then you throw his love of a loud film score into that, and it makes it more problematic. I think that there are bits of Tenet of the score that are genuinely brilliant. The foils track for the much maligned catamaran sequence is really good because it ditches a lot of the percussion. There is this kind of Vangelis style electronic thrumming propulsion to it. And I thought if more of the score had sounded like that, it might have been more interesting. As it is, the harmonics of it are so often, as is so often the case in Nolan scores, the harmonics, the emphasis on percussion for the sake of percussion creates this kind of like bludgeoning impact, and you don't want to be bludgeoned. You want the score to provoke, to stimulate. You don't want it to batter you about the head, but unfortunately that seems to be what Christopher Nolan likes, and it's a bit of a shame, because I think that Goransson has done more interesting things like that before. It's not a terrible score. I think it's quite a decent score. It's not the best thing that he's done, but it doesn't exactly dissuade me from the music doesn't dissuade me from the fact that what we've basically got here is a very, very cheesy, as I said in our previous episode, 1960s style James Bond movie with Kenneth Branagh doing the impression of evil Kermit. I will cut balls off and stuff them down your throat. Would you like me to do that? And it's kind of like, oh, blimey, like really, like just like it's like, do I laugh? Do I cringe? Do I take it seriously? Like what am I meant to do? Like,
yeah. 90s Bond villain. That's what he is.
Yeah, I mean, not even 90s Bond villain. I mean, 60s Bond villain. I mean, if he turned up with an eye patch, it wouldn't have been out of place. Like it would have made absolute sense. Like or a scar over his eye. Like just
put John David Washington on a bed, stick a laser.
Yeah.
You really could have done that.
So you'll see the problem with balls is balls will soon be vaporized by laser that is coming up your genital area now, but you'll tell me what I do with the time travel thing, and it's kind of, it's literally like that. It's literally like,
It is, I know. I rewatched it recently, and it lost a little bit of the something on the small screen. I won't lie. It wasn't quite as enveloping as it was when I saw it in a cinema, but I still enjoyed it a lot. But it is at points silly. But I think the music is good. I really do like a lot of what he does on this, and it will be interesting to see if Nolan goes back to Zimmer for his next project, or he sticks with Goransson, or he alternates between the two. We'll see what happens. But yeah, that was my number one. And that's it. We've put together a decent list there, I think, of things for people to go and listen to, of scores.
That was quite an epic journey. That was an epic journey through a whole year, and what a year that was! It's like unlike any other year in living memory. We've managed to kind of rescue things from it. I'm quite proud of that.
Yeah, me too. I know, more than we might have thought. And let's just hope that we don't have to do the same thing at the start of 2022. Because everybody's
don't tempt fate seriously.
Yeah, I know. Everybody's banking on 2021 being the year that things start to get back to normal. And we'll see.
It's just,
I think it will be a bit of an all over the place year, full of stops and starts. And I think realistically, it's going to be a little bit of the same for the majority of it, really. But hopefully with a bit more hope in tow, in various different ways, and hopefully towards the end of the year, maybe we can start getting back into the cinemas. That might be good, but who knows? We will see. But we've definitely managed to find gems within what will go down as a terrible year, in general, and a year that everyone will just want to forget. But yeah, this is music not to forget. So yeah, it's been fun picking all of these out. And we haven't quite figured out what we're doing with the podcast yet, have we, in 2021? We haven't really talked about when we're going to be back, what we're going to do, how often, or anything like that. But we'll be back, won't we, Sean, in the next few weeks and months or whatever to talk about film music.
It might be more of an ad hoc thing, mightn't it? Because let's face it, we're in an ad hoc situation with theatrical and also streaming distribution. Obviously, Netflix really put out their slate, didn't they, a few days ago? And Netflix are really aggressively hammering the market now. But I suppose we really need to see what the theatrical slate is going to be, because until the moment that gets fixed and that gets back to some kind of consistent pattern, it's really hard to try and predict. It's hard for us to try and get into a pattern of talking about film music regularly as attached to each of the individual films. So yeah, I mean it's my money would be on the back half of the year, post June. I reckon the back half of the year is when, we could potentially talk about some stuff before then, but I think back half of the year is when things are potentially going to start to get more consistent in terms of cinemas reopening and things like that. I'm hedging my bets at the moment. I'm trying not to get too optimistic about things happening too early.
We can't predict anything, really, as this last 12 months has proven. So we hopefully will come back and talk a bit, every now and then about some stuff. We'll figure it out. We'll try and come back semi-regularly. But then, maybe towards the end of the year we can get back into a bit more of a pattern and do a few more episodes. So we'll keep you posted. Those listeners we do have, people who are tuning in, so we appreciate it. Thank you, Sean. Where can people find you if they're waiting for a bit more between the notes in the meantime?
So you can find me on I write for a variety of outlets. My main bread and butter is cineworld.co.uk/blog. You can find me on there. I'm also now doing bits for Composer magazine. I've cited them a few times throughout this recording. Also Film Score Monthly. I am excitingly now writing my first book, which is really which is a really big journey. That's a good thing that came out of 2020, because I don't think I would have been in the mindset to kind of take a breath and get that up and running. So yeah, so I'm kind of here and there, all over the place. So just give me a, if people are so inclined, just give me an online search, give me a Google search. So I'm sure stuff will come up. And
your book has relation to what we do on this, so we'll talk more about that as time goes on, won't we? Because it's very exciting what you're going to be doing there. So yeah, stay tuned for that, guys. But yeah, you can find me at AJ Black Writer on Twitter, at my website culturalconversation.co.uk. For everything I'm up to, really. So check me out should you wish. But yeah, thanks for tuning in. Hopefully, as I say, we'll have a Spotify playlist. We'll put things on there for you to listen to based on what we've talked about. But yeah, we hope until we see you next time that you stay safe and well, and you have a good start to 2021. Thank you for joining us for another episode. Remember, we're part of the We Made This podcast network, and the music of 2020 is not all we're discussing right now. So we'll give you a little taste of what else you might have missed on the network in a minute. But until then, we hope you enjoyed the film music we've discussed, and we will see you next time discussing the music of film and TV between the notes. Elsewhere on We Made This. The time is now a Millennium podcast.
But no, I mean, I will say that Rise of the Machines also kind of like argues against
Terminator 2, of course.
Back to where it was.
Like Rise of the Machines, like then goes, maybe they're both right, and shrugs its shoulders. It's like, maybe you can prevent Judgment Day, but only for a little while. And it's like, that's not an argument. Pick a side. Pick a lane. You can either change the past or you can't. None of this wishy-washy. You can change it sometimes, but you can't really change it. So it all balances out. Yeah, no, pick a damn side.
Don't say the C word.
On the back of my right arm, I have a tattoo of Phil Collins. It's the front cover of No Jacket Required.
This was the one that I expected you to pick, I'll be honest with you. Because it is my favourite of your tattoos.
Yeah. I mean, it was a tattoo I got as a joke. A lot of my tattoos that I've got, a lot of everything that I do is because it's a joke or if I think something's funny.
We Buy Records.
Eric Clapton and Van Morrison have released an anti-lockdown song. How do you think about this? Where does this sit on the shitometer?
I think it redefines the shitometer.
Right.
So I think it's raising money for musicians who are affected by the lockdown and the lack of gigs, etc., which is a good thing.
Yep.
But then you see Van Morrison and Eric Clapton, a bad thing. So,
right.
Do you know what I mean? I mean, I love Van Morrison's music. I don't particularly like Eric Clapton's music. I quite like the 60s stuff. But they're a couple of whinging old men, aren't they? Old man babies complaining that they can't go and lick whoever they want.
Ooh.
I know, but that's what they're singing about. I think I haven't checked that. I assume that the lyrics are about.
You can take it as read that I haven't heard it.
It's not likely to have a banging donk on it, is it?
It's unlikely to have a banging donk.
Check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This podcast network. Between the Notes is produced and edited by Tony Black, who hosts alongside Sean Wilson. You can find Tony on Twitter at AJBlackWriter and Sean on Twitter at Seano22. You can find Between the Notes on Twitter at BTW_notes, on iTunes, your podcast app of choice, on Spotify, Stitcher and on Spreaker, where the show is part of the We Made This podcast network. For more podcasts all about TV, film, books, music and popular culture in general, you can find We Made This on Facebook and on Twitter at We Made This Pod. Thanks for listening.